right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. We'll give a few more seconds for participants to come online. I see people coming in right now. Thank you to everyone for joining us from wherever you're coming in from. Give it a few more seconds until, I think 10:02 till people come on. All right, we're at 10:02. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Bessell, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Human Trafficking Legal Center. Welcome to another installment of our Voices from the Litigation Frontline series. As a few housekeeping reminders, please remember to, actually, you know what, you're all muted right now. We've just moved to the Zoom platform, so I'm getting used to this system. So during the Q&A, I'll unmute everyone and feel free to ask questions. You can also raise your hand with the raise hand icon on the bottom or enter chats in the Q&A box below. A note that this session will be recorded and sent to attendees and absentees, so don't feel like you have to take down notes furiously. And today we are thrilled to be joined by Professor Siobhán Mullally, recently appointed as the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. Professor Mullally is the established professor of human rights law and the director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the School of Law at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and served as president of the Council of Europe Group of Experts on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings from 2016 to 2018. She's here today to share her reflections on the 20-year anniversary of the Trafficking in Persons, or Palermo Protocol, and talk about human advocacy and aspect of that. Professor, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much to the Human Trafficking Legal Centre for this opportunity to engage with you and with participants about the work of my mandate. I'm always hugely impressed by the work of the Human Trafficking Legal Centre, the commitment to policy and legal reform, and the strategic litigation work that is ongoing worldwide. And it's really that global reach, that expertise, particularly in areas of labour exploitation, but also more broadly sexual exploitation, forced criminality, that is really important to the work of UN bodies such as my UN mandate, to be able to draw on that, to learn from the experiences of the strategic litigation initiatives and the expert policy guidance and proposals for reform. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity. I hope that there will be a good Q&A session and discussion because I think it's really important to hear from you about what you see as key priorities at this moment in terms of the fight against human trafficking, how to make our existing legal instruments more effective on the ground in terms of delivering concrete change, and also reflecting on what has been the practice to date in terms of engaging with UN bodies, including with my mandate, and how we can strengthen that engagement with civil society, with lawyers, with academia, and really moving out to ensure that we have a global reach. So I'm just going to say a few words about my mandate, about the work that I've been doing over the last 3 months since my appointment, and then key thematic priorities for the first 3 years of my appointment and immediate upcoming work. And really, this is just to give you a snapshot of the range of issues that the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking mandate engages with across the UN system, but also in trying to liaise with regional bodies and civil society on the ground. In terms of my thematic priorities for this next 3 years, and obviously these will have to be refined in much more detail year by year and in terms of the actual outputs and arrangements in relation to these. As I'm sure you all know, the Special Rapporteur is mandated to deliver 2 reports per year, one to the General Assembly and one to the Human Rights Council. To the Human Rights Council, it's in June each year, and to the General Assembly, it's in October. And I've just delivered a report to the General Assembly in October this year, which was prepared by my predecessor, who I know also participated in this webinar series. So Maria Grazia Gianmarinaro's final report, which reflected on the Palermo Protocol 20th anniversary, and also questions around whether a new legal instrument and much more robust human rights-based legal framework is now needed. And that was the report that I was presenting on to the General Assembly. I'd be happy to talk about that further. There was very good engagement by states, many questions from a range of sources. And so I think it's useful to reflect on some of the points in that. So that being kind of the core output that I have to achieve each year, there's then a question of how to do that and what topics to prioritize in terms of those reports, and thinking about the different audiences, the Human Rights Council on the one hand and the General Assembly on the other, which is positioned in New York, in UN headquarters in New York, so more linked into the kind of priority themes that are addressed in that setting. Next year in 2021, I will be focusing on 2 areas, one of which work had already been started on and is ongoing in a number of different organizations at the moment. My report to the Human Rights Council will focus on the non-punishment principle in human trafficking law and in practice on the ground. And it will look at this across the range of forms of punishment that we are now seeing, including, for example, deprivation of citizenship or citizenship stripping, detention, and there are concerns around potential increases in detention and forced removals against the background of the COVID-19 pandemic. It will also look at administrative sanctions and criminal sanctions that are linked to irregular migration and the increasing criminalization of irregular migration, but also administrative sanctions, for example, imposed on persons for engaging in prostitution, and the administrative sanctions that can persist over time that can really increase the burdens on people who are trafficked and really impact or impede their capacity to move beyond the experience of human trafficking. So that will be the first report, and it really tries to draw on, for example, the position paper that had just been concluded in July by my predecessor, Maria Grazia, and then looking across the whole breadth of the international human rights legal framework to provide an in-depth legal analysis of the obligations on states with regard to non-punishment, highlighting in particular challenges that we are seeing in relation to people who are trafficked for the purpose of forced criminality, including children and young people. And so linking into a wider youth, peace and security agenda, and looking at the kinds of questions and concerns that are arising in relation to forced conscription or recruitment into armed groups and groups that are labeled as terrorist, and what is happening then to those who are victims of trafficking for that purpose of exploitation. How is the non-punishment principle being respected and implemented on the ground? The second report, which will be to the General Assembly, again, so reflecting that different kind of audience, and as it is in October 2021, that is Women, Peace and Security Month at the UN. It will focus on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, trafficking in conflict settings, and in particular, looking at the emerging discourse and references and practice in relation to terrorism and counter-terrorist activities on the ground in conflict situations or in situations of internal displacement. So in particular, we have seen since 2015 increased numbers of references to links between trafficking, terrorism, and counter-trafficking strategies in the work, in reports of the Secretary General, in reports from the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict, in reports from the Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict, and in the Security Council itself. But a concern, I guess, is that this is very much focused on a securitization agenda and questions around security and criminal justice, and not addressing the full implications of a human rights-based approach that would look at the human rights obligations of states and international actors in relation to those who are victims or survivors of human trafficking, and also critically in relation to prevention obligations. So drawing that work together that has already started in relation to trafficking, women, peace and security, children in conflict settings, and bringing in the whole range of international human rights obligations beyond the Palermo Protocol, but looking at all of the relevant UN human rights treaty bodies, their work, and looking at the relevance of international humanitarian law as well. So that will be the focus of the two immediate upcoming reports. We will be circulating a call for submissions. We will be engaging with civil society and hosting regional consultations. So this is really an important opportunity to raise key concerns, examples of good practice, of bad practice, serious conceptual, legal and practical issues that are arising on the ground. 2021, of course, it will be important to continue to highlight the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and all of the UN special procedures and treaty bodies are addressing this quite urgent situation where we are seeing reports of decreases in numbers of victims of trafficking being identified, formally identified and referred for protection, and also reports coming in about increases in forced removals without a pre-removal risk assessment, taking into account risks of trafficking, experiences of persecution or re-trafficking, or questioning what kind of long-term protection will be provided on return to countries of origin. So that work, it will be important to keep bringing that to the fore, and also highlighting the critically important contribution of civil society in terms of prevention and service provision, and the challenges being faced in many countries in relation to repression of civil society, particularly NGOs working with migrants, and also, of course, cuts in resources and funding. So those feed into the thematic priorities for the next 3 years, which will be looking at trafficking and conflict and humanitarian settings. Secondly, looking at trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation and really looking at the gender dimensions of such. And thirdly, looking at migration and trafficking, but bringing in, continuing to build on work that has already been done, but bringing in questions around access to protection, to asylum, complementary forms of protection, and also looking at the kinds of tools and instruments that are being used to regulate externalization programs, bilateral agreements in relation to labor migration, regulation of recruitment agencies, effective access to remedies, and the protections being afforded to migrant workers, including in particular those in irregular situations. Just to conclude, I'm going to comment a little bit on working methods and what I've been doing for the first 3 months, which is really hosting a range of meetings to engage with as wide a range of actors as possible. But really a key priority for me is to build relationships and partnerships with regional bodies. As I'm sure you all know, my mandate is based in Geneva. We have resources, we're a small team, but we have a global mandate and an obligation to engage globally. So in particular, I've already had meetings with the Special Rapporteur on the rights of refugees, migrants, asylum seekers and internally displaced people of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. We have discussed the possibility of engaging further jointly with the African Commission and also with the African Union and with its Peace and Security Council. In particular, they have prioritized trafficking also as an action for the African Standby Force. So we want to look at how we can mobilize resources and work together. I have met with the chairperson of the African Committee on Rights and Welfare of the Child, and a formal address to the public session of the committee is scheduled for either December 1st or 2nd. And again, that's critically important to try to build capacity on the ground and in the region in terms of responding to human trafficking and ensuring that there is a human rights-based approach in place there. My mandate has visited Africa in terms of the country visits just once to Nigeria. So it's a gap in terms of a region that has not been visited frequently, only once to date. But as we know, there are very significant situations of trafficking, particularly in conflict situations of forced displacement internally, and also in the context of labor and sexual exploitation internally within the African Union. There are significant legislative and policy developments ongoing. For example, East African Communities Trafficking Bill has been pending now without final ratification for 4 years. There are also interesting developments at a regional level in West Africa. So again, it's important to link into those and build those links. I have met at the broader UN level. I have met with all of the chairpersons of UN human rights treaty bodies to discuss how responses to human trafficking are linked into their work and in the reviews of state party reports, in communications, in the inquiry mechanisms that are available to them. Tomorrow, I will formally address the 102nd session of the CERD Committee, the Committee on Racial Discrimination, who is very actively engaged in looking at questions of trafficking in the context of their work. And that's hugely important in terms of thinking about questions around racism, discrimination on grounds of race and ethnicity, and how that impacts on responses to human trafficking. I've also scheduled a formal address to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at their next session, which will be beginning of March 2021. And we're looking at an intersession engagement with the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, again, really looking at their work on missing migrants and follow-up responses and states' obligations, including in relation to trafficked persons. We're looking at doing some work jointly, of course, with CEDAW and also with the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And linked to that engagement, I've made a number of submissions to treaty bodies. So a formal submission has been made to the CERD Committee on its draft general recommendation on racial profiling. And we've highlighted in particular racial profiling at borders, in border management regimes, and in relation to responses of law enforcement bodies, which may a concern that it may hinder identification and referral to protection at borders or more broadly by law enforcement authorities. I've also made a formal submission to the Migrant Workers Committee on their draft general comment on detention. And in relation to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, I've made a formal submission on their draft general recommendation on child rights in the digital environment. And here again, that's highlighting the potential positive role that digital technologies can play in relation to prevention, awareness raising, and also investigations and prosecutions of trafficking, but also the heightened risk, as we know, in particular at the moment, of online exploitation, including online trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, but also recruitment for forced labor or forced criminality. So that will hopefully be available publicly soon. And that is a topic that I will also be continuing to work on jointly with other special procedures, specifically the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery and the Special Rapporteur on Sale and Sexual Exploitation of Children. We're looking at doing a joint initiative, possibly a report or a visit or engagement with the tech sector, focusing specifically on online exploitation and how to try to move the dial, if you like, in relation to responses by the tech sector and also in relation to states' positive obligations to prevent exploitation. So that's a very broad snapshot of some of that work with treaty bodies and other special procedures. It may also be of interest to you that we have been engaging with the Libya fact-finding mission, which was set up in summer of this year. And we've had already a formal exchange of views with them, highlighting the work that my mandate had already done in relation to trafficking in Libya. And we will be following up on that again. So far, they've not been able to visit Libya, but it's hoped that they will be able to in the near future. I've also been engaging with the Global Protection Cluster, and some of you may have seen their briefs released and published today, which highlight heightened concerns around increases in trafficking in humanitarian settings linked to forced displacement, climate change, conflict, and they highlight in particular Ethiopia, Yemen, South Sudan, Mali, Niger. So these are all areas of concern, and that we're looking at working closely with them, the Trafficking Task Force in particular, and of course UNHCR. I've also had meetings with the UN Migration Network, and just earlier this morning, virtually presented at the Asia Pacific Regional Review of the Global Compact on Migration. The preparation, in fact, it was the stakeholder consultation on the regional review, which will be coming up. And that is something we're hoping to continue doing in engaging with those regional reviews and ensuring that the commitments in Objective 10 of the Global Compact and the rollout of action plans at national and regional level really take seriously positive obligations in relation to trafficking for all forms of exploitation and looking at how those are emerging. There are a number of working groups already doing interesting work on detention, for example, on bilateral labor agreements, and on access to services, all of which are hugely important and relevant in the trafficking context. So that's a broad snapshot of my work to date and immediately upcoming work. And I'd be very happy to hear from you, any comments or questions. I would say that we're really keen to encourage more engagement with the Office of the Mandate. That can be through communications to respond to an urgent situation or in relation to an allegation of violations that have occurred. Simply email the Trafficking Mandate, which is srtrafficking@ohchr.org. But also we have the opportunity to intervene in relation to upcoming legislative or policy reforms that may be positive or negative. If there's a concern that there would be a regression in human rights standards or serious concerns that there isn't compliance with the human rights-based approach to responding to human trafficking, that is something that we would like to hear about and we can usefully respond to. We can also intervene in court proceedings, but of course that needs time and notification in advance. But again, it's something where we can have an impact and can just bring the voice of the Special Rapporteur mandate to a proceeding highlighting human rights obligations. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think your collaboration already in these few short months with the other special procedures is really a roadmap for our organizations to collaborate with other groups on, really pursuing an intersectional approach to this as we move away from this criminal justice framework from the past 20 years. Thank you to all who have already started to submit questions to the Q&A box. You can see that at the bottom of your control panel. Also raise your hand icon if you'd like to be unmuted and ask your question. And I have a first question from Mark Taylor. Mark, please go ahead.
Yes, Madam SR. The question is, will you, as the UN Special Rapporteur, address the issue of modern slavery as a separately defined activity from what we all know as trafficking in persons? And just as a back note, I remember when the ILO in 2012 released its global estimate on forced labor, and it seemed to be a key moment in time because the ILO stated explicitly that human trafficking can be considered as forced labor and captures the full realm of human trafficking for labor and sexual exploitation, or what others call modern day slavery. So it seemed to be finally a definitional unity that the community had achieved. But now, 8 years later, we have some member states that are clearly advocating for a special separate definition of modern slavery. And this threatens a widening gap with others in the world who subscribe to the Palermo Protocol's definition on trafficking in persons. So realizing that you're just embarking on your appointment, do you have any preliminary thoughts on this subject?
Okay. Could you just repeat the final part of the question? It dropped off.
Sorry. So there is an apparent, there's some that are trying to formalize a definition of modern slavery, a term which, heretofore was really informal and usually associated with trafficking in persons. Have you given any thought to, how you would approach this? For example, some countries like the UK and Australia are encouraging others to enact legislation on modern slavery, distinct from trafficking in persons legislation.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question and obviously very topical. It's something that's very much of concern, I think, in the UK and in Australia, to some extent elsewhere, but it's quite specific to legislative developments in both of those jurisdictions. The term has also kind of garnered, I guess, public awareness in that it taps into an awareness about experiences of slavery. As I'm sure you also know, there's some controversy around the use of the term and whether it should be used today or whether it appropriately recognizes or acknowledges historical experiences of slavery. In terms of my position and my mandate is based on the Human Rights Council resolution, which was reaffirmed again in July and is quite extensive, quite detailed, which I think reflects the work of my predecessors, Maria Grazia Gianmarinaro, and before her as well, Sigma Huda and Joy Nazilo. But you can see the progress in terms of the detail and depth of the mandate and the Human Rights Council resolutions. But it's firmly rooted in the definition of trafficking that draws from the Palermo Protocol and that you find in legislation in many jurisdictions. It's repeated in the Council of Europe Anti-Trafficking Convention, in the EU directive, and it's found in legislation in regions across the world. So in terms of my mandate, that is what I work with and will be working with. There are obviously links and overlaps into the broader discourse on modern slavery. It's more, I think, a question for the Special Rapporteur in contemporary forms of slavery in relation to his work. And we will be working closely together, have already met several times, and also the Special Rapporteur on sale and sexual exploitation of children. But I think there is so much work that remains to be done in relation to strengthening the human trafficking legal framework. I think it's important to work with that definition, look at where there are difficulties around interpretation of the means, for example, interpretation of exploitation, drawing on work that has been done by UNODC and others That can include trafficking for the purpose of forced labor or practices similar to slavery, for example. That terminology is often used. So I think the concept of trafficking is somewhat broader there. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
It is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. A reminder to please keep putting questions in the Q&A box or raise your hand if you'd like me to unmute you. Another question coming in, you mentioned the non-punishment provision. Can you talk a little bit more about what pressures or levers are necessary to institute national legislation that, to this effect, to the non-punishment provision?
Thank you very much. So there's a very useful position paper on non-punishment that's published on the website of the Special Rapporteur mandate just in July. And obviously there's been work done elsewhere by OSCE and others. A key concern, I think, is how the non-punishment principle is implemented, in particular in situations where there's trafficking for the purpose of forced criminality. And that's where we see states more reluctant or struggling in terms of meeting their obligations with regard to non-punishment there. I would say particularly in the context of the so-called foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon, so in the context of terrorism and counterterrorism strategies, but also in relation to, for example, cannabis cultivation or other areas of criminal activity. And there, I think we find states concerned that the non-punishment principle somehow might undermine an anti-impunity agenda. And I think it's important there to emphasize that it doesn't do that. And this came up in the discussion also at the General Assembly. If you're punishing the wrong people, victims or survivors, rather than those who are the perpetrators of crimes, then the law enforcement resources are being used incorrectly. But you're not furthering the anti-impunity agenda in that way. The non-punishment provision itself is not found in the Palermo Protocol, as I'm sure people know, but it is in the principle and guidelines of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on human rights and human trafficking. It's also found in the recent CEDAW general recommendation and is referenced, for example, in CERD in its reviews of state party reports, including an upcoming report as well. I think it's in relation to Singapore. So we can find its roots in the international human rights law framework. But I think it's a challenging one for states. What you found, and I found this in Council of Europe monitoring work, for example, you've different types of legal systems. Prosecutors, investigators are concerned to retain a level of discretion, for example, may not always want strict guidance, and that can be a challenge. So it's looking at how is it provided for at a domestic level? Is it enshrined in legislation or in guidance? And it's important also to ensure that it applies early on so that a victim or survivor of trafficking is not being subject to criminal proceedings. But then there also needs to be provision where if criminal proceedings have progressed against them, that it's possible to stop those or to reverse those in terms of expungement clauses, for example. So it's really important that there is a precise legal framework in place. Thank you.
And a follow-up question on that from my colleague Anasuya Sham, given the nexus with migration that you've talked about, many countries in this current moment have a very anti-migrant stance. And you've noted that victim assistance and services must not be conditional on cooperation in criminal proceedings. So how, within this current anti-immigrant, anti-migrant sentiment, how does civil society convince states to make the shift away from towards non-punishment and then away from conditioning services on cooperation with criminal proceedings, all within this very negative attitude towards migrants?
Thank you very much. I think that's a really important question, and it's a difficult challenge. Obviously, you have to think of who you're engaging with in terms of trying to bring about change or persuade those who may view trafficked persons primarily through the lens of irregular migration, and that's a challenge. So first, I think it's important to always highlight the obligations of states in terms of the human rights law framework and their positive obligations of due diligence, of prevention and protection. So highlighting those, and that does give a certain strength in terms of the arguments. But then in particular in relation to assistance, and it's really important to emphasize long-term assistance, not short-term and not conditional. And perhaps one of the more convincing arguments for states that may be reluctant to engage with the human rights-based approach is that we know that ensuring assistance over a longer period of time can help to prevent situations of re-trafficking arising, or where victims or survivors end up in situations of destitution. They're more likely to be at risk of exploitation again. So that kind of cycle continues in those kinds of circumstances. If, on the other hand, assistance and long-term social protection and social inclusion measures are provided for, that can facilitate or enable victims and survivors to engage with criminal justice proceedings if they wish to. And of course, many do, because they are also concerned to ensure accountability. But that takes time, but it certainly is not facilitated or supported by short-term conditional assistance measures that don't recognize or allow for the trauma that has been endured and the kinds of supports that are needed. So on the one hand, a kind of instrumentalist or pragmatic argument can be used that this may support criminal proceedings and the anti-impunity agenda, but also in terms of just recognizing the need to break that cycle of victimization and exploitation. Thank you.
So a long game, to be sure. And thank you to those who are continuing to enter questions in the Q&A box that's located at the bottom of your control panel. Please keep them coming. Another question from Shana Horwitz, who asks, you've spoken previously about the need for early victim identification. Is that something that you see states taking responsibility for, or is that more civil society that should be engaged in that, or a combination of both? And how do we get to that better system of early identification?
Thank you. I mean, I think it's both. It is the responsibility of states to ensure identification and early identification referral for protection. But civil society have a key role in supporting those processes. And also more broadly, I would say healthcare professionals, border guards, all of those in humanitarian settings. So the whole broad range of humanitarian actors. That may seem very obvious, but unfortunately, the information we get from the field and on the ground is that there isn't always that level of awareness or precise information around the steps to follow to ensure early identification and referral for protection. So I think enabling civil society participation is really important. And if you're in a situation where civil society and NGOs are increasingly being subject to strict regulation and often repressive measures, or not being given access, for example, to detention centers, which can be at ports of entry or airports, or so-called hotspots, then that is a problematic. So an enabling environment for civil society is critically important, and then putting in place structures that allow for that multi-agency response. And there are many examples and models of good practice on that. I know OSCE, ODIHR is bringing out an updated handbook on national referral mechanisms that again emphasizes the role of civil society. But also, as I said, more broadly, looking at engagement with healthcare professionals, all of those involved in humanitarian settings, and those working in child protection and in education as well, who can play a critical role. Yeah. Thanks.
And to that point on the limiting space for civil society organizations, do you anticipate doing work in collaboration with the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders? And should our groups start to submit more comments to the other special procedures as well?
Yes, absolutely. The new Special Rapporteur in Human Rights Defenders is a colleague from Ireland, Mary Lawler, who's previously Director of supporting human rights defenders. And we've already been in several discussions, but she has in particular highlighted recently in a number of statements the role of migrant rights. So that is something that she is very much aware of, has been working with the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights of Migrants on that. So that is something that has come up. My mandate has also raised concerns around criminalization of humanitarian assistance and of the work of NGOs and the impact. Obviously, I have to work within my mandate, so highlighting the impact that that can have in terms of the role of civil web page and email. That can be through, as I said, communications concerning specific allegations, or it can also be about, you know, policies or practices or emerging law reform. So it's a good way to mobilize and shine a light on a problem and change. And we work quite closely together, joint initiatives, make.
Oh dear, we seem to have lost the Special Rapporteur. 1 second, hopefully she will pop back on in a minute. Thank you all for your patience, and please continue to pop in your questions. I will just see. Apologies all, I'll just keep a running monologue going. All right, well, we're hoping for the Special Rapporteur to come back online shortly. Apologies for this technical difficulty. And let's give her 1 more minute. Hopefully you can all get a coffee or tea refill. All right, everyone, thank you for your continuing patience. We're still trying to get the Special Rapporteur back online rather. I'm sure you can all tell, but this is my nightmare. So please bear with me 1 second. All right, everyone, I'm still trying to get in touch with the Special Rapporteur. I hope that she's not having any internet issues. I'm going to continue to, we have this event till 11. I will turn my video back on so you can see. We have this event open until 11, so I will keep the line open. Please feel free. Oh, there she is. Oh, okay. She's
Hello, I'm sorry.
Hello.
I got an error message and was cut off.
Oh my goodness. All right, thank you. So we will make sure to address that in post. I apologize to you and everyone for that technical difficulty. I believe we were in the middle of a comment that you were wrapping up, but I am happy to move on to the next question since we had this book.
Okay, I think it was a comment in relation to the mandate on UN Special Rapporteur and Human Rights Defenders. And I was just noting that, yes, I would strongly encourage people to engage.
Oh, great, fantastic. And we have another question from Susan Kennedy, who asks, what would you consider a good outcome 2 years from now, proceeding along the lines of your current work? What would a good outcome look like in 2 years' time?
What would be the question?
Sure. The question was, what would a good outcome 2 years from now, preceding your current work, look like? Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Can you hear me? Ma'am? Oh. Hello? Oh, okay. All right, everyone. So we seem to be having internet issues across the pond. As I was in the middle of saying, we have this webinar open for the next 10 minutes. I will keep this open in the hopes that Special Rapporteur can pop back online. We have several questions in the queue. Thank you to Kate, Carolina, and Susan for your questions, and hopefully we can answer them. So please feel free to stay on the line. I'll make a noise to alert you that we're back on. And in the meantime, thank you so much for bearing with our technical difficulties. And for those still here with us while we're waiting to resolve these technical difficulties, an announcement that we have been recording our previous webinars and they will be uploaded soon to view. So stay tuned for those recordings. And we'll send out an announcement once those are available. And for those of you still with us, if you have any suggestions for future topics on access to justice, remedies, or other trafficking issues, please feel free to send them through the chat or to info@htlegalcenter.org. Or also please feel free to fill out the survey at the end of this webinar. And for those of you who attended last night's On My Side 2020 event, thank you for attending. And for those who unfortunately could not attend, don't worry, we will have a video recording of that event up soon for you to watch at your leisure. And thank you for supporting our organization as always.
Hello, Sarah. Hello, Sarah.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes, I can. I'm not sure what's happening.
Oh, no worries. Okay. Well, we have you back. That's no worries at all. And how's your correct connection? Are you okay to continue? We have about 6 minutes left in the program.
Okay, I'll leave my camera off just for now, just in case.
Okay. Sometimes it helps.
Okay.
Fantastic. So we were in the middle of a question from Susan Kennedy, who was curious to know what would a good outcome 2 years from now preceding your current work look like? So 2 years into the future, what can we hope to see?
Two years' time, what would something look like? I'm sorry, I missed it.
No, no worries, no worries. Yeah, so the question was just, 2 years from now, and yes, hello. 2 years into your mandate, what would you hope? Oh, yes. Hello, can you hear me? I can also put it in the chat.
Would
Susan's
it be possible to type the question in chat?
No problem. I was just saying the same thing. I will put it here. I've just put it in the chat, and that is from Susan Kennedy.
Okay, what would a good outcome 2 years from now in relation to my current work look like? Okay, thank you for that. I think one, I would like to see specific human rights obligations being included in legislation and practice, of course, at domestic level. So really moving beyond the kind of dominant focus on criminal justice, which is hugely important, of course, in terms of combating impunity, but removing conditionality in relation to assistance, ensuring long-term access to social protection and to residence, regularization and a pathway to long-term residence and citizenship where that's relevant for victims of trafficking. Effective access to remedies, so really looking at legal aid, long-term legal aid and access to compensation, and much more heightened regulation of labour recruitment agencies, a strengthening of resources of labour inspectorates, filling the gaps in terms of the scope and mandate of labour inspectorates and ensuring their proper resourcing, and recognising the value and importance of worker-led initiatives, and also much better tools to regulate and manage and combat online exploitation, and looking at the human rights of victims also in that context. And linked to my priority in conflict and humanitarian settings, ensuring that much greater knowledge and awareness for counterterrorism, that there really is a look at obligations of non-refoulement, that questions around citizenship stripping as a form of punishment is addressed, and obligations of repatriation, for example, for victims of trafficking and their children, that those are recognised and addressed and taken seriously.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And we're at the hour, and so I think given the technical difficulties, we would love to end here, but then Professor, have you back at another time to continue, because there's a lot of questions coming in, so I think this has prompted a very robust conversation. And for those on the line, thank you for attending this Voices from the Litigation Frontlines webinar. Professor, we are so thrilled to have you on, and we're really excited to see what the next few years of your tenure will be as Special Rapporteur. For those interested in submitting information to the office, I posted the contact information for the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons office and communications procedure in the chat. So please, we encourage you to send information, as Professor said, please send information to her office to alert her to trafficking situations. And we also encourage you to also submit information to the other special procedures mentioned in today's webinar. Professor, thank you again so much. We are so thrilled to have you here. And everyone, we look forward to seeing you at the next Voices from the Litigation Frontlines webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.